Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we will be marking the 55th anniversary of the Six-Day War that changed history not only for Israel, but the Middle East. Well, welcome to the programme, and today's special guest is all the way from North London. He's a good friend of mine and a friend of this programme. He is Zalmi Unsdorfer, the chairman of Likud in the UK. Zalmi, it's always a pleasure to have you on the Middle East Report, so I'm very much looking forward to what you have to say. But for our viewers watching, can you give us a little bit of an update on some of the activities you've been involved in regarding Israel, regarding your community, the Jewish community as well?
Well, as far as the Jewish community is concerned, the big concern here in the UK is obviously anti-Semitism, and all of that goes with it. We were very encouraged this week to hear in the Queen's speech that there is going to be a law passed to end boycott, divestment, and sanctions (BDS), and using public funds and public organisations and local authorities and such like. To fund hatred of Israel and undermining of the Jewish state. So that is very much a domestic scene. And as far as Israel is concerned, obviously they're dealing with an upsurge in almost an intifadic level of civil disobedience and unrest, which is very disquieting, but I think shows that we must restore deterrence in Israel.
Absolutely. And Zalmi, this is a special programme today because we are marking the 55th anniversary of the Six-Day War that literally changed history. We saw God's divine protection in that war over Israel as she was facing possibly a war of genocide. And not only that, Israel tripled in size, gained the Sinai from the Egyptians, liberated Jerusalem, and we saw the unification of Jerusalem. Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland of Israel, fell back into Israeli hands, and of course Israel also won and conquered the Golan Heights, that strategic mountain plain overlooking the whole of the Sea of Galilee, in which happened in 6 incredible days from June the 5th to June the 10th, 1967. You told me before the programme that you were 16 when that incredible war took place. What are your memories of June 1967 and the Six-Day War?
Particularly in the run-up, I remember that my father, who was involved in Jewish community work in London, had a visiting member of the Knesset at our house. And we had a little black and white TV, as one had in the lounge. And there was a news report in ITN, I think it was, with a map showing arrows coming from 6 different directions pointed at this little tiny sliver of Israel with its back to the Mediterranean Sea. And although I wasn't really involved in Zionism at that time, not at the age of 16, didn't understand the politics or any of that, it looked pretty hopeless and frightening. That's my memory, and the rest of it, well, you know, as the week went on, it just became one euphoria over another. And whilst I didn't appreciate the miracles that were happening in the field at the time, obviously now in later years we can see just how miraculous. What was it? 130 hours war and 130 hours of miracles.
Yeah, no, absolutely incredible. But I think, you know, so many lies, so much misinformation has been put out about this war, particularly from Israel's enemies, that we need to put it in its historical context and also in the context of the Cold War. But we can't talk about the Six-Day War unless we really talk about some of the huge mistakes that were made, not by Israel, but by the government and US President Eisenhower during the Suez Crisis of '56, because we know that Nasser, for example, wanted to nationalize the Suez Canal and took control of it from the British. And this was the last colonial enterprise done by the British Empire and the French Empire to recapture the strategic Suez Canal. And Israel then used this as an opportunity to push back Egyptian aggression. Of course, Israel conquered the whole of the Sinai Peninsula. The Russians were getting very concerned about this one moving in, and I think out of that, President Eisenhower became very concerned. So instead of demanding something in return of the Egyptians, Israel was then forced, weren't they, to give back the Sinai to the Egyptians. And in order to do that, there was a UN peacekeeping force put in place. And of course, the Straits of Tehran were also opened again to Israeli shipping. Looking back on it, how much do you think that was a strategic mistake made by the government of the United States under President Eisenhower?
Well, there were huge mistakes, because if that retreat had not been forced on Israel, then obviously the whole Nasser phenomenon would not have happened. So it's just unfortunate that whenever colonial powers get involved with Israel, Israel is always the one that has to pay. So Israel was given a Jewish national home under the British mandate, the League of Nations mandate. And then 60% of it was given away to the Kingdom of Jordan, to form the Kingdom of Jordan. And we then were left with 40%, and which now the Palestinians, so-called Palestinian nation, wants half of as well. I mean, how many times do you have to slice up the cake? So I think it was a monumental mistake at the time. And I think the Arabs would have been, generally speaking, a lot better off today had that Suez fiasco not been turned into some political strong-arming by America over Britain in terms of withdrawal. It's really, these decisions have very, very long-term implications.
Absolutely, and also the context of the Cold War, because we can't look at the Six-Day War and what happened without putting it in the context of the Cold War. And this is the main reason that I think the United States and Harry Truman voted for the modern state of Israel back in '48, because he saw that Israel could be a potential ally in the Middle East, and so did Russia at the same time, or the Soviet Union. But then we see that Turkey, then I think in '52, became a member of NATO, and as part of that, they were the first Muslim state or country to say that the rest of the Arab world and the Muslim world should recognize Israel's right to exist and make peace with Israel. And of course, then from '56 onwards, we saw the massive rearming of Egypt and Syria by the Soviet forces, becoming client states of the Soviet Union. How much do you think this played in the part of the world? Because it wasn't just Israel versus, for example, the Arab world, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq as well, but also this was Israel against the Soviet Union as well.
Yeah, I mean, the Soviet Union's arming of the frontline states was huge, and even during the last days of the war, they were opening up more shipments to the beleaguered armies of the Arab League, and without the weapons and without the dynamite, there wouldn't have been a conflagration like that. Israel was not seeking war. Israel, didn't start that war. It was started because the Tiran Straits were blocked, and that was, as they call it, a casus belli, a reason for war, effectively, a declaration of war on Israel. So, yeah, these things were major misjudgments. And I guess, you look at the misjudgment of Putin today in Ukraine. Even the biggest countries, and with all of the legal advisors and money that they have behind them, can make massive miscalculations.
Absolutely. And also, if we talk about the context and the build-up of the war of 1967, I mean, this is a war that would have been a total annihilation of Israel. That the fact that the Egyptians under President Nasser had forced the UN peacekeepers out of the Sinai, who were really acting as peacekeepers between Israel and the Egyptians. Then, as you mentioned, the blocking of the Straits of Tehran to Israeli shipping, and then the militarization of the Sinai, and the fact that the Egyptians and the Syrians signed a joint military declaration that they were going. But also, if we look at the situation in the north of Israel, we saw constant shelling by Syrian forces on the Golan, on the Kibbutzim in the Galilee, and Israeli fishing boats on the Sea of Galilee as well. So that situation was intolerable. And then, of course, we saw as the war started that the Kingdom of Jordan decided to join in. But can you share with us Israel's fears that this was potentially another Holocaust on the scene, and that Israel was really preparing themselves for the worst and the worst case scenario?
Well, in the early days, this whole thing started just after the Israel Independence Day. I think it was 15th of May in '67, when the Israelis were parading through West Jerusalem and had to make arrangements with the Jordanian army not to come too close to the old city, to the effectively the Mamilla crossing, which was the front. It was a bit like Checkpoint Charlie at the time, barbed wire and so forth. And if you would have told an Israeli at that time, a week from now, all this will be gone and our flags will be flying over Jerusalem, they'd never have believed it. This is the miraculous movement literally within the space of a week. But what you say about the United Nations in terms of the peacekeeping force was being thrown out ejected by NASA from Sinai. Remember, that didn't go to the United Nations. It was unilaterally decided by the Secretary General. There was no debate in the United Nations that this force should be taken out. And if there's a constant that's run for all these 55 years, it's the UN. Because if you'd ask any Israeli general at the time, they will tell you, if they were still alive today, they will tell you that the biggest fear amongst the Israelis was in terms of the military. The military knew exactly what they were doing. They had all their plans prepared. The worst fear they had was the UN imposing a ceasefire as soon as they saw the Jews winning. While the Jews are losing, the United Nations are going to be silent. Kick out the peacekeeping forces from Sinai, leave Israel defenseless, that's okay. But as soon as the Jews get the upper hand, there's the United Nations intervening. And in the last days of the war with Syria and the Golan Heights, it was literally an hour-to-hour struggle with the United Nations, saying you're not observing our ceasefire, and Israel saying as soon as Syria stops shelling, we'll observe the ceasefire. But Israel was trying to get every inch of land on the Golan Heights. But the UN has always been a constant through this, and it's egregious, it's unpleasant, it's anti-Semitic, and it's just quite shameful.
We've also seen that same tactic deploy in Israel's recent wars, whether it's against Hezbollah or against Hamas as well. So it's interesting to see its origins here really in the Six-Day War. But also I think we have to mention the role played by Lyndon B. Johnson's administration in the States, and how Israel's then foreign minister, and I think Israel's finest spokesman, Elie Cohen, went on a trip to Washington to try and get diplomatic support and American support. And also at this time, we've got to make our viewers aware that Israel was not being funded by the US. I think it was JFK did supply Israel with some Hawk missiles at the time, but that's the only military hardware that the Americans supplied Israel. It wasn't until Israel's success after the Six-Day War, the Americans started to fund and arm Israel militarily, because they saw Israel as a great asset, not only for freedom and democracy in the Middle East, but also to push back the Russian advance. So it was critical, wasn't it, that Elie Cohen got the support of Lyndon B. Johnson, even though he really didn't give Israel the green light, but gave them the amber light that if you're under attack, you'll have our diplomatic support. How crucial do you think that was in the thinking of Israel's Prime Minister Levi Eshkol at the time to take a preemptive strike?
Well, Levi Eshkol was a pretty indecisive Prime Minister. I mean, he really was a stumbling, bumbling person, and the Israelis were very, very anxious that he shouldn't retain the defense portfolio. And there were demonstrations outside his home and outside the Knesset saying, give us Moshe Dayan. Give us Moshe Dayan, the general from your Suez crisis. And eventually Dayan did take over. But Eshkol was a bumbling, he was not the man for the moment at all. He was not a commander-in-chief by any stretch of the imagination. Abba Eban, the consummate diplomat. You'd never even think he was Israeli. He had this beautiful British colonial accent. And he was a really great guy. And he was a man for the moment. As far as the United States is concerned, yeah, once we showed what we could do, then Levi Eshkol went with Yehuda Avner to Lyndon Johnson's ranch and asked him for Phantom jets, and he got them.
I love those Phantom jets, known as the Air Force as well. And Zalmi, I think we also have to bring into calculation some of the lessons learnt in Israel's War of Independence, and this was the need to take a preemptive strike. In other words, the IDF Doctrine was the lessons learnt from Israel's War of Independence in 48, that Israel cannot afford a war on her territory. So therefore, in any future wars, Israel has to transfer the battlefield to the enemy's territory in order to protect Israel's population centers such as Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, Ashkelon, all the major cities in Israel. How do you think this was so crucial in the way that Israel's military generals from the IDF actually planned the incredible preemptive strike?
Well, the preemptive strike was called Operation Focus, and it had been in the works 5 or 6 years before the Six-Day War. It had been practiced, it had been it was so intense that, and very, very much grounded in intelligence. The Air Force personnel knew every airplane and every pilot in the Egyptian Air Force. They knew what to bomb, when, and how. So the first thing they did, and this was literally 3 hours over Egypt, and something like 100 sorties in a matter of a couple of hours. First, they bombed the runways and disabled them. That left the planes defenseless on the ground because they never had any hangars in the Egyptian airfields. Then they took out the bombers, which were supposed to be sent to Tel Aviv. And then they just took out the fighter planes and literally completely disabled the Air Force. But the miracle that happened was that that raid, there were so many things that could have gone wrong in that raid. It came up on Jordanian radar, and the Jordanians sent a coded message to Cairo saying, they're coming for you. But Cairo had changed the codes the night before.
Whoa.
I mean, figure that out. Where does that happen?
Yep.
Okay, so there were enormous tailwinds for us, but it had been practiced for many, many years, down to the last detail.
I mean, I was also aware in the first moments that the war broke out in June the 5th, that Israel also took out the Iraqi Air Force, and I think they must have taken out the Syrian Air Force as well. How important is it, do you think, that Israel won air superiority in that war of 1967? So knowing that this would actually protect Israeli towns and Israeli cities and Israeli population centers.
Air superiority was absolutely crucial to do. And had it been that they were under hangars and under concrete bunkers or whatever, Israel would have had a plan for that as well, because it's an absolute must. When you have a tiny sliver of land, most people you ask in the street, say, how big is Israel? Well, Israel is about the size of China or the size of Brazil or whatever. And you tell them, it's like smaller than New Jersey, right? It could fit into Wales, and they just cannot believe it. So there's no way that we can do anything without complete air superiority.
And how much do you think the kind of rhetoric on the Arab street of President Gamal Abdel Nasser's speeches, saying that we will drive the Jews into the sea, raised that fever amongst the Arab street that then demanded that leaders go to war against Israel? And also, how was the Israeli population preparing for war? Because there were news reports, I think, they had a blackout windows, they were preparing to have mass graves. I mean, potentially Israel was looking potentially at another Holocaust.
Well, the rabbis were commissioning parts of the public parks for cemeteries because they really were, the government was anticipating huge casualties, which never actually materialized. But what many people don't know is that at the time, 1967, the Israeli Broadcasting Authority, the TV channels, they were in their infancy. And 90% of Israelis were watching Arab TV. And the Arab TV was pumping out all of this stuff about, you know, we are going to take over, have lunch in Tel Aviv, and we're going to push the Jews into the sea, and it's going to be bloodshed, and there will not be one Jew left alive, and we will avenge this, that, and the other. And Jews had to listen to this. Now, in the opening days of the war, the opening hours of the war, when the entire Egyptian Air Force was taken out, massive victory against Nasser in the early hours, Israel couldn't say anything about that publicly. They kept the lid on it. Why? Because they worried the United Nations would impose a ceasefire. And from that moment on, this was the worry. Every time we won something, there was a greater danger that we would be stopped in our tracks. That was a real, can you imagine people sitting at home with their TVs and they're seeing what I saw, for example, in London with these arrows, but they saw it much worse because they were bloodthirsty Arab leaders talking about the slaughter of the Jewish people.
And how strategic was it that Israel took out the Egyptian army, took out the Egyptian tanks, regained the Sinai after after the Suez War of '56, and then could look at Egypt from the Suez Canal?
Look, you know, that wasn't a strategic imperative. You know, we didn't need the Sinai. You know, Begin gave it back. Yeah, great buffer zone, but in today's world, not really. That wasn't the imperative. The imperative was to get back the Golan Heights, and the imperative was to get back the West Bank and achieve that, because that had been illegally taken by Jordan out of in the War of Independence. You know, it was never Jordanian territory. It is disputed territory, but it is never your Jordanian territory. So we liberated that, and okay, it remains disputed. You know, have a nice dispute.
And also, I know that the Israeli government sent urgent messages, I think through Gold on My Ear, to the King Hussein of Jordan not to get involved in this conflict, giving plenty of warnings that if you do get involved, we will be forced to attack you. But his big mistake, wasn't it, that he believed the Egyptian propaganda that they were completely defeating Israel, that the Israeli army was being defeated in the Sinai, and so this led King Hussein of Jordan then to start attacking and firing missiles over to West Jerusalem. How crucial was that to Israel actually not only liberating Jerusalem, but also taking Judea and Samaria, which is the biblical heartland of the modern state of Israel?
Well, remember, in the biblical times, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. 1 plague, 5 plagues, 7 plagues, 9 plagues. He just kept hardening his heart, and he was responding illogically. If you see, you know, your rivers of blood, you see frogs, you see hail, lice, darkness, whatever you have, you know, any leader would say, okay, enough, just Jews, get out of here, leave me in peace. And it was completely counterintuitive. And what was done by Hussein was completely counterintuitive. In the opening days of the war, he handed over control of his entire military to an Egyptian general, one of Nasser's generals. So from then on, it wasn't even in his control. So it wasn't just the propaganda coming out of Egypt, it was the fact that it was under Egyptian control.
And tell us about the battle for Jerusalem, because I mean, this was actually crucial, as you mentioned early in the program, that Jerusalem was divided between West and East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem was controlled by the Jordanian forces, and there was no way that any Jewish person or any Israeli could actually visit the Western Wall or the holy sites in the old city of Jerusalem. And how delicate was that war, knowing that Israel had to protect the holy sites, had to protect the old city in order to actually defeat the Jordanians? Israel,
even until the day before, didn't believe it was going to retake the old city and the Western Wall. Not at all. There's a famous story that the night before, basically the Jordanians were shelling West Jerusalem, including the Knesset, the day before. And there was the Begin and some of the other lawmakers were forced into a ground floor utility cabinet with mops and buckets to take shelter because of the bombing. And in that room, Begin said, listen to all the shelling. We should take it back. now. And the Prime Minister said in Yiddish, that's a thought, okay? But it was only a thought. The night before, during the shelling, there was one soldier who ran into a shelter with a whole lot of civilians. And there was an old lady there, and she saw his uniform and his boots, and because the boots were full of sand from the Sinai desert, because they had moved them from the Sinai desert, the troops, because of the stunning victory there, they moved them up to do the war in Jerusalem. And literally, they were not trained for city warfare. They were trained for, warfare in the desert. And she had this bag with her, and she said, tomorrow you're going to go into Jerusalem and you're going to take back the Western Wall.
Wow.
And he said, I don't think so. It's not in our plans. And she opened this bag and she gave him an old flag, Israeli flag, which she held with such reverence as if almost maybe she had knitted it, or maybe it belonged to somebody famous in her family, or I don't know what. She gave it to him. She says, when you go there, I want you to hang this flag at the Wailing Wall. And in all the newsreels, you will see this little flag on the grate, which had been put up there by this soldier. And after he was debriefed, he said, why did you put that up? He said, he told the story about this old lady, that she knew what was going to happen the next day. The old lady was never found.
Wow. She could be an angel then.
You never know.
That's an amazing story. I didn't know that story, so thank you for sharing that with us. And let's have a look now at the battle for Ammunition Hill, when Israeli paratroopers caught and took over Ammunition Hill from the Jordanian forces. And of course, anyone who was part of the Revelation TV tour of Israel back in 2009 would have visited, like myself, Ammunition Hill.
The 55th Paratroopers Brigade still serves as a reserve unit today, as it did in the 1967 battle for Jerusalem.
We're part of the 98th Division, which is more or less the equivalent of the 101st Airborne Division in the U.S. Army.
Lieutenant Colonel Anshel Pfeffer commands the 28th Reserve Battalion of the 55th Brigade.
We do the most interesting and most dangerous and most challenging missions in the IDF, so I believe. And as paratroopers, we live up to our code, walking on our feet in the night quietly and hitting the enemy wherever he is without him knowing about us in advance.
Pfeffer, a high-tech executive, took me through the trenches at Ammunition Hill, where battalion soldiers fought for Jerusalem 50 years ago.
Well, Ammunition Hill was the bunker of the Jordanian police academy, which is just behind us. And the police academy was the main objective of that specific battle before they continued towards the old city.
And this was, day 2 of a 6-day war?
Day 2. After taking the police academy, they advanced towards, it's called today the Ammunition Hill, and they spent many, many hours trying to advance from trench to trench.
How many men were here fighting?
They began almost 200, and very, very few remained standing at the end of the battle.
My. But they weren't trained for this kind of warfare, were they?
They were very surprised. They described it as a very big disappointment not being parachuted to fight the Egyptians, but then, of course, it became one of the most important battles in Israeli history. The battle specifically here, but also in other places in Jerusalem, was all done in very improvised Israeli-type warfare.
It's hard to understand how men with equipment on their backs, I assume, rifles, grenades, whatever other equipment they had, how did they make it through these narrow trenches to take the enemy on, to encounter them?
It's a very good question. Unfortunately, many of them had to climb above, and the stories describe young soldiers telling their commanders, I'm going to go up with my machine gun, and as you're walking down in the trench, I'll go on top. And every time they advanced 1, 2, 3, 5 feet, and then the next guy climbed up and continued it. The previous one was hit, and that's how they managed to advance. Some of them pulled back the injured towards the injured facility with the doctors behind, but they had to keep advancing.
I can stand here as an American and look at our history and talk about Revolutionary War, Civil War. That's hundreds of years ago. Right. This is 50 years ago.
Indeed.
You know, I don't want to get overly dramatic. How can you? But this is hallowed ground. Do you see it that way?
Yes, it is. This ground is holy ground as far as the way we see it, because our friends, our comrades fell here. It's a place we respect very much. As you can see, it became a national monument.
Standing by the half-track that barreled through Lion's Gate into the old city, Pfeffer told me of their honor in continuing the heritage of those who have gone before them. Have you talked to any of the men who fought and some of your fathers, grandfathers, and talk to them about their emotion of that moment?
Yeah, it's important to mention, we every year on the Six-Day War Commemoration Day, we meet with our predecessors. We also remember the fallen and we talk to them. It's a very strong part of our heritage.
What motivated these men?
At the end of the day, it's fighting with your friends, with your comrades, what they call brothers in arms, and that's what makes people at the end of the day rise up towards enemy fire and advance. The big vision, the mission, conquering Jerusalem, all that, it's important, but at the end of the moment when you rise up towards the fire, it's for your friends.
Are you men motivated like that today?
We believe so. We look up to them. Today's young soldiers are as, both in their professionalism and also in their values, are as good as we were then.
Pfeffer, who commands about 700 reserves, told me how important the lessons of that war are to soldiers today. How has the past affected the future, the training of the men now?
The battle for Jerusalem in 1967 was one of the first battles in urban warfare. And if you look around today, both in the IDF and also the US Army and any other Western army, the challenge of fighting terrorists and other organizations which are fighting from within civilian and urban warfare environments has become the most common part of warfare, and we're learning.
But even today, you're surrounded by people that want to destroy you, that want to annihilate you, wipe you off the map, drive you into the sea. Your existence is questioned. So do you live in a defensive posture, or do people live in fear?
Well, I'm a reserve soldier.
Right.
80% of my time I'm with my family, at my work, enjoying life, having a great time. And I think most of Israelis live a peaceful, very happy, I'd say Western-like lifestyle. Every couple of years, we have a few weeks of tension, and they know we're here to defend them. And now it's our turn.
Scott Ross for CBN News at Ammunition Hill in Jerusalem.
There's another thing to do on your do list if you go to Jerusalem. Definitely worth a visit to Ammunition Hill. Zalmi, how important was Ammunition Hill to Israel's main aims of actually recapturing Jerusalem? Because also mentioned that it was the site of Mount Scopus, and prior to the Six-Day War and prior to Israel's independence as a state, of course, Mount Scopus was the home to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and was opened in the early 1920s. I actually think it was opened by Lord Balfour himself.
Yes, I mean, it's on French Hill, was a very, very important section. And the thing is, I mean, the Jordanian Legion was a very, very powerful force. Unlike the Egyptians, the Egyptian army didn't match up to the Jordanian. The Jordanian fighters were very good fighters. You know, many respect the British trained.
Yeah.
You know, Sandhurst, you know, with King Hussein originally went to Sandhurst. I think his son went to Abdullah went to Sandhurst. These were well-trained people. And this Ammunition Hill, that battle was a very costly battle for Israel in terms of lives. You know, we lost about 750 or 800 dead in that war, and a large disproportionate amount was in Ammunition Hill. Very important. But again, all the time we were telling Hussein, stop shooting, we don't want a war. There was no intention to open that front up. And in fact, soldiers were given instructions not to return fire unless it was lethal fire against them. But the continued shelling of Western Jerusalem, you know, was destroying housing and buildings and so forth, and became very, very dangerous. So basically, Jordan brought this upon themselves in the same way as Nasser brought that on himself. And then later, in the last day of the war, how Assad brought destruction on himself when we almost walked into Damascus. And we would have marched into Damascus. The road was open. The Syrian army had completely retreated. And were it not for the United Nations, we could have gone into Damascus. I don't think in any shape or form Israel would ever have considered going into Damascus, because who the hell wants to look after, you know, millions of Syrians? You know, we never wanted that. We wanted our Golan Heights and to prevent this shooting of our kibbutzim in the Galil.
Absolutely. But going back to Jerusalem before we talk a bit about the Golan Heights, I mean, those Israeli paratroopers that were led, I think, by Israel's Chief of Staff, Itzhak Rabin, and to actually go to the Old City. And I think they drove through and fought through Zion Gate in the Old City to get to the Western Wall. There was a sense of kind of destiny on these Israeli soldiers, that they were liberating Jerusalem. Their intention was to get to the Hakotel Hamaravi, the Western Wall, and to pray at the wall. How symbolic and important was that battle? And do you think they had that kind of weight of Jewish history on their shoulders?
They certainly felt that they were changing Jewish history, and they were told when they went in there that they should consider this alongside the battles which had been fought by the Maccabees and all the other battles throughout 2,000 years of Jewish history. And they did have a sense of destiny, whether they were religious or secular. And they mainly were secular in those days. The march of religious Zionism only started as a result of the Six-Day War, as a result of the liberation of Judea and Samaria, being the biblical heartland of Israel. So take someone like Moshe Dayan, completely, avowedly secular man. But when he went in and he put a little note into the wall, as one does, the journalists were quick to open up his note, and he put in an extract from Psalms. This is the work of God. They are wonders in our eyes.
Amazing. Absolutely incredible. So many of you will probably be aware of some very famous photographs that took place when the paratroopers liberated the old city of Jerusalem. They got to the Western Wall and were so overcome by emotions. Many of them cried, but many of them actually rejoiced. So let's have a look now at this report behind some of these incredible photographs that have become the iconic image of the Six-Day War 55 years ago.
For more than 7 decades, David Rubinger chronicled the history of modern Israel. From the 1947 UN vote for partition, paving the way for the Jewish state, to many of its leaders like David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir, Rubinger was there, camera in hand.
In retrospect, consider that was very lucky, because I happened to have a professional life which coincided with the creation of a state. 60 years, that gave me a chance that very few photographers have to really cover a story, an entire story from A to Z.
His most famous photograph came in 1967 during the battle for Jerusalem.
Tell us about the picture that has become an icon in Israeli history.
Well, that night the night before I was in Sinai. I was with the brigade that broke through at Rafiah, and I heard on the radio I had mentioned about Jerusalem. The helicopter came down to pick up some wounded. Nobody asked me, there was no tickets where you should for that flight. I just squeezed in.
In the midst of the Six-Day War, Rubinger flew from the Sinai to Beersheba. He then drove to Jerusalem, stopped for a quick visit with family, and headed straight to the Western Wall.
Rubinger arrived here just minutes after the paratroopers captured the city. The wall was crowded, and in 1967, the distance between the wall and nearby homes was just about 10 feet. So to get a better perspective, Rubinger got down on the ground and began to shoot.
And I was lying on the ground and shooting, and these three soldiers just walked by. I got 3 frames, nearly identical.
Rubinger's photo not only captured the heroism of the paratroopers, but also the end of a 2,000-year-old dream of the Jewish people to return to Jerusalem. Given its fame, Rubinger didn't even think it was the best picture he took that day. He preferred this photo of Rabbi Goren riding the shoulders of the paratroopers. Even so, he chose the negative of the 3 paratroopers to give the government over the Goren photo. Then, in 1967 terms, it went viral.
The government press office started printing and handing out for 2 lira, 2 pounds, which is the equivalent of about 20 cents today, I think. And anybody could buy it, and everybody bought it. AP put it on the cover of their book. I was mad, I was hopping mad.
Years later, Rubinger changed his mind.
And I'm now grateful for all the thieves, because it made my career.
Yeah.
That one picture.
That day at the wall also changed his life, leading to a wave of emotion.
The crying was a result of the 3 weeks that preceded this moment. You must not forget, Israel was in a mood of facing doomsday, everything. Everybody thought, maybe we'll win, but we'll cost thousands.
Instead, Rubinger said the Six-Day War was like life from the dead.
If you're about to die, or you think that your chances of survival are very, very low, and you're not only alive, but Israel is 5 times its size. You've beaten all the Arab armies. You're king of the world. The whole world admires you. You burst out crying.
Rubinger died just a few months before the 50th anniversary of his famous photo. While he often disagreed with Israel's policy after the '67 war, Rubinger felt very special about the country he followed with his camera.
I think it's unprecedented in history that people did in 60 years what this country did in 60 years. From 600,000 people or so in 1948 to 7 million, with progress on all fronts, in all fields. So with all my criticism, with all my misgivings about what's happening now, in the historic view, I think there are very, if any, precedents in history at all that can compare to it.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, the Western Wall, Jerusalem.
Very moving. That was obviously a few years ago. That Israel is now 74 years as an independent sovereign state, and Israel's population is now about 9.5 million, according to the latest statistics. Zalmi, you said you actually knew David, that photographer who took those iconic images of the soldiers at the Western Wall. But in terms of Judaism, in terms of world Jewry, how significant was it to have the retaining wall of the Second Temple back in Israeli hands or Jewish hands?
Because it's all that we have. You know, the Arab world has got many places that it can visit. The Christian worlds have many places that they can visit. This is all that we have left, because everything was destroyed. The Romans did a very, very good job. So for us, we pray at every Seder night of Passover next year in Jerusalem. The picture of the wall is in every single Haggadah that we read on the Seder, at the Seder table. Jewish homes have always got some picture somewhere with either an artist's impression or pencil sketch or whatever of the wall, and people praying at the wall. And we all pray towards the wall. We pray towards Jerusalem, but it is intended to pray towards the wall. We're not praying towards a mosque, we're praying towards the wall. So it is the center, it is the epicenter of Judaism in today's world and the Jewish nation. And the liberation of Jerusalem, it was not just getting people to a wall, or not just getting people to the place of the first and second temples, but it drew as a magnet thousands and thousands of Jews from all over the world, United States and Europe and so forth, to come and study the Talmud in Jerusalem, to go to seminaries and yeshivas in the old city of Jerusalem. And it kindled the religious Zionism that we have today in Judea and Samaria. Lovers of the land, people, ordinary people, charitable people, people who've got the most unbelievably Jewish and Christian values of love thy neighbor, peace and all this kind of thing. Those are the people who are rooted in the territories. They call the settlements, but I call the homelands of Judea and Samaria. That all started with this one event.
Which fulfilled biblical prophecy as well, didn't it? And actually seeing the word of God come alive only 55 years ago. I mean, there's scripture mentioned, I think, in Ezekiel 37 talks about the dry bones, and literally talks about the vineyards on the mountains of Israel. Now, prior to 67, Israel didn't have Judea and Samaria in their hands. They didn't have the Golan Heights. So clearly this is a very recent fulfillment of God's word that God gave to Ezekiel thousands of years ago.
Yeah, I mean, these are steps. So there was the Holocaust, there you have the dry bones, anyone looking at the Jewish nation at that time, literally half of which had been literally incinerated, would say, how is this nation ever going to rise again? We've almost destroyed them. Hitler, did a pretty good job. How will that rise again? And what? In 3 years, it was a Jewish state, okay? And by 67, we had tripled our size. And, and now it's a high-tech, behemoth, effectively. It's leaps and bounds. So, and even during COVID, it was at the forefront. This tiny country was at the forefront. The medical discoveries, the technological, whatever you want to call it, it's one long miracle, but in stages.
Absolutely, and also Israel is a blessing to the world and is a light unto the nations. But we also have one individual to thank, really, don't we, for Israel's stunning victory over the Syrians and being able to capture the strategic Golan Heights, and that was Elie Cohen, and the role that he played as being a spy for Israel. He was so charismatic that he was able to get to the top echelons of the Syrian regime to get that much needed intelligence that Israel needed in order to win that war. Share with us the crucial role that he played, enabling Israel to defeat the Syrians and to actually take the Golan Heights.
Well, he was able, he did get to the very, very top of the president's inner family circle. And he gave amazingly valuable intelligence at huge risk to himself, which ultimately resulted in his capture and hanging. But he mapped out a lot of the positions in the Golan which were essential for Israel's capture of the heights. Obviously, the initial assault on the heights was done with aircraft, but the bunkers were very, very well hidden in olive groves and orchards and so forth. And he had mapped those out pretty well. But there are many, many Elie Cohens today in Iran, working in Iran at huge risk to themselves. And they're providing vital intelligence to Israel. And I would say that the same must apply to Syria. There must be a number of Elie Cohens still in Syria, because of all the Iranian rocket emplacements that they have there, because they have enormous intelligence, pinpoint.
I mean, there was that dramatization of Elie Cohen, I think, by Netflix. Bashir Cohen decided to play the role of Elie Cohen, and what I remember from that series, which was quite very, very insightful, was the fact that he wanted to say, look, your Syrian troops up on the Golan are doing a brave and courageous job, but they're too hot there. We need to build eucalyptus trees. So of course the building of eucalyptus trees so that the Israeli army knew and the Air Force knew exactly where the Syrian positions were, so when the 6-day war came, were able to bomb them. But the one story I think was also quite remarkable, and I learned about this on my first time to Israel and my first visit up to the Golan Heights with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 1996, was the discovery of the ancient Israeli town of Gamala, and how that Gamala stood with Jerusalem against the Romans and was destroyed by the Romans in AD 67. And then the Israelis found the city of Gamala, which was famous for its wine production, in 1967 after the 6-day war. How significant was that?
Well, I think it is, I mean, you obviously have a better knowledge of that history than I have, because you took the tour. But Gamla is a very, very important part of the Golan Heights today, as you know. It's a huge wine distribution exporting region. And I mean, it wasn't just that the Golan was taken for defensive purposes. It's now burgeoning. It's being populated. It's very, very important to put a population between armies, because that creates intelligence all of its own. You can't just have an open space. So very important, pivotally.
Absolutely, and of course one thing that is incredibly special about the Golan Heights as well is that archaeologists have found discoveries like Gamla, but also farmers as well. Israel looking to see what plants grow in the Golan Heights, what vineyards they can plant. Use the Bible as a guide, and they've got a fantastic community. And when I was last up there in 2019 was for the opening of the new town called Har Trump, after President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem and his friendship towards Israel, and to actually be there and knowing how much the Israeli community up in the Golan really value, support. Amazing people up there, absolutely incredible people.
Yeah, I mean, look, it is biblical prophecy that says that when we return to our lands, the lands will produce bountiful harvests. And, you know, you look at the Gaza Strip when the settlements were established down there, and they literally took sand and they created farms out of that. I mean, they made the desert bloom. They invented, effectively, the cherry tomato, which won awards all over the world. So I do believe that all of this, the land will produce for the people who are supposed to be there. But the people who are not supposed to be there will simply eat dirt.
Seen that for myself, especially if you go on the Jordan Highway, down from the Galilee,
yes,
through the Jordan Highway all the way to Jerusalem. You see there that land that Israel once had is given back to the Palestinian Authority, and you see like the Israeli farms or kibbutzim covered in flowers, all green, and then you see the territory being given to the Palestinian Authority. It's just arid desert. Yeah, completely. So there's never a truer statement there, Zalmi. But looking back at the 55th anniversary of the Six-Day War and having that hindsight to do, how significant was that war, and what's the legacy been of the Six-Day War?
The legacy of the Six-Day War is that we are respected when we stand up for ourselves. We are respected when we fight. We are disrespected when we are on the defensive, and we continue to find ourselves on the defensive politically and so forth with all this huge Palestinian media machine that goes on. I mean, just look at, you know, this week the sad death of the Al Jazeera correspondent. We don't know, you know, how she died. We don't know whether it was a stray bullet or whatever the case may be. But the instant condemnation of Israel. You know, it's not as if anyone's allowed a fair trial in anything. So I think it was Menachem Begin's son who once was at a reception that I held for Likud, and at the time we were being excoriated. Israel was being excoriated for some particular thing. I mean, you know, what day of the week it is, what excoriation is it? And he said, I would rather that Israel was vociferously criticized than elegantly eulogized. And that, I think, is terribly important. We have to do what we think is right. We have to defend our people. And if it doesn't suit the rest of the world, well, tough.
And how much does the world kind of need to understand, particularly during the Six-Day War, that Israel was considered the David going against the Goliath? And sadly, after this war, Israel then became the Goliath, and then the Palestinians were then considered the David, and the whole narrative changed. Do you think that Israel probably lost a sense of reality when they won that war? Because it was only a few years later that Israel faced the horrific war of the Yom Kippur War of '73.
Yes, I mean, there was hubris. There was you know, too much of laissez-faire. And 1973 was a wake-up call. I believe it was a wake-up call from God. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're doing a surprise attack, okay, choose Yom Kippur. But on the other hand, there was no mobile phones in 1973, and all the Jews were in synagogue, so it was easy to call them up. So it was as good as it was. It was as good as it was bad. But yeah, we cannot possibly be complacent, least of all with Iran.
Zalmi, thank you so much for being my guest today. I've really enjoyed the program. I'm pretty sure that our viewers have as well, as we've looked back at 55 years ago and what is known as the Six-Day War, or the miracle of the Six-Day War. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you for watching this program today at home. We can now all visit Jerusalem. We can pray at the Western Wall. We can visit Judea and Samaria, where the site of Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant now rested in biblical times, all because of the Six-Day War. We can even go onto the Golan Heights and look at the beautiful views over the Sea of Galilee and enjoy the mountain of Mount Hermon, because of Israel's defensive actions during the Six-Day War. But more importantly than that, we literally saw God's divine protection and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So this is important to give thanks to the God of Israel for Israel's stunning victory in the Six-Day War. So thank you for watching today's Middle East Report.